We continue here. The Senegalese electorate have been urged to turn out in numbers and show their opposition to a last-minute delay of the 25th of February presidential election. On Monday, Parliament backed President Macky Sall's decision to postpone the poll by 10 months, sparking a fierce backlash from the opposition and an international community. The unprecedented move has also called into question the West African country's reputation for rule of law and political stability. Joining us now from Scotland to unpack developments in Senegal is political analyst Musa Mdunge. Mr. Mdunge, a pleasure to have you on the program this evening. Now, as a political analyst, how would you assess the current situation in Dakar following President Macky Sall's decision to postpone the elections? And what implications does this delay have for the future of democracy in Senegal?
Thank you so much for having me, and good evening to you and to your viewers. So, as a political analyst, this year is quite a consequential one. We know that about 60 countries are going to elections this year, and these elections are going to be quite meaningful in the move of the global economy and the global world order. And Senegal is a very interesting country, particularly given its role in West Africa. It got its independence in 1960. It has never seen a coup d'etat in the way and in the formation that we are seeing currently. It has never seen an undermining of rule of law in the manner that the political elite have done this time around. And it is quite telling that this is happening in a moment where that region faces huge challenges. A wave of coups have happened, and even the integrity of ECOWAS, the regional body in West Africa, seems to be undermined. And as per usual, the African Union is almost always left with nothing to say, no position, or at best some sort of a statement encouraging peace and stability, but never doing much to do anything in terms of intervention. And that's where we find ourselves today.
To take from an article by John Grace, who's a columnist for The Guardian, he describes a sense of paranoia and tension among residents in Dakar due to this increased security measures and allegations of government suppression as well. How do you interpret the impact of such measures on the political climate and also the civil liberties in Senegal?
Indeed, there have been rumors, conversations, whispers that, President Macky Sall would, in fact, try to run for a third term. We know that his term ends in April this year after having served as its president for the past 12 years. And the moves that he has made in terms of really increasing, the ante when it comes to the involvement of security forces and agencies in terms of these elections, the very fact that he unilaterally, postponed these elections with the backing, of course, of Parliament, speaks to a leader who is in doubt of, one, his party's own political future, as well as his own legacy as well. This comes as, he has doubts about his own preferred candidate, the Prime Minister of Senegal, in terms of their run in this election. Unfortunately for him, the Senegalese opposition have been quite buoyant in stating their opposition towards the current moves. What will be interesting is that regional response. What will be interesting is that international response. What will Western countries say, such as the United States of America, such as France, whom we know Dakar has been the colonial center of France's West African empire, and continues to be symbolic and a symbol of French power in Africa. And so the fact that you have Senegal moving in the direction that it is moving is quite telling. And the question is, who then fills that gap? And that's where it's going to be very interesting. Unfortunately, for Nigeria, the traditional power in that region, it's losing a key ally, it's losing a key player as the region tries to renegotiate, find itself, and bring forth stability, given what is happening currently in that region. So very interesting times, but, quite telling that the president has decided to move in this way. And it is quite disappointing to see a democracy such as Senegal fall in the way that it is falling.
You're quite right. I mean, Senegal is seen as a beacon for democracy, but this postponement of the presidential election has also sparked widespread protest and unrest in Dakar. In your view, Musa, what are the root causes of this discontent? And how do you anticipate it will evolve in the coming months?
Well, look, I mean, the beauty about democracies is that fundamentally, at the end of the day, the citizenry is able to pass judgment on the performance of the political leaders whom they have elected, but also to shift the political elites towards a particular direction as favored by the electorate. The fact that you have so many of these events happening currently that are trying to scuffle the voice of the electorate, the voice of the citizenry, is an attack to that most precious and most fundamental endeavor of democracies, that indeed you would have a government that is by the people and for the people. And so fundamentally an attack on the elections, the integrity of these elections, and as much as the president has done this move in a bid fundamentally to protect the integrity of these elections, given the challenge between the judiciary as well as parties when it comes to the qualification of certain candidates to stand on these elections, is in doubt currently. He's using this move to try and create a condition where it seems he is resolving the political issues currently and legal issues currently. But in actual fact, he is in fact engineering a constitutional crisis. And that's where the problem is. And the problem is, if we continue to have this constitutional crisis, what will it say about the integrity of the political system, of institutions, of democracy, but as a country as a whole, and most fundamental, the well-being, both economically and socially, of the Senegalese people? And that's the challenge that we see currently with the current events in this country.
I want to hear more on your view on the international response. You had started alluding to some of your observations. So President Macky Sall's decision to postpone the elections has been met with international criticism and also accusations of undermining democratic norms. How do you think this crisis will then affect Senegal's standing, especially at a global stage? And what diplomatic challenges does it then pose for the government?
Indeed, I mean, as I stated, that Senegal is a critical country in the region, in the continent as a whole, has played a significant historical role in the Organization of African Unity as well as in the African Union. You will recall that alongside President Thabo Mbeki and President of Nigeria, Obasanjo, these three men were quite critical in framing the new Partnership for African Development. And so Senegal has played a critical role in the continent and in the region particularly, and in a time where we see a lot of political security, instability in the region, Senegal's voice and its contribution was going to be quite fundamental in resolving these challenges. Now that it is the case in point, it is quite telling that from a regional perspective, ECOWAS has condemned the moves, but has been very, very hesitant to do anything beyond that, given the retaliation it received in its position on past coups and political, if I might say, insurrections in other countries. And so, interestingly, from that perspective, we're not likely to see a strong African position coming to the fore, or intervention for that matter. And from the West, yes, we've seen America, state its claim and make a position in terms of this particular issue. What will be interesting is to see where do the French go in terms of this issue, the European Union as well, and also the new kids, if I were to use the term, in terms of the region. Fundamentally, if we think of China, if we think of Russia, they will also have a stake in this in these particular events. So again, Senegal is another flashpoint in a scheme of flashpoints around the globe, of conflicts, of political events that are shaping and reshaping the way we see democracies and the way democracies will operate. And again, this is a question that all democracies must fundamentally ask themselves. How do they deal with the current challenges that they are facing currently in the world? And secondly, look at how young Senegalese population is. Look at the fact that it is young people in Senegal who are in the streets and who are driving the protest towards these actions. And it's going to be critical to see how does the voice of young people come to the fore, particularly in Africa, where we know that, this was supposed to be the African century, but in many ways it has become the African disappointment because many of our leaders have not come forth with plans, with visions, with strategies on improving the lives and ensuring that African young people can indeed live up to their potential. And so Senegal is a seminal warning, a seminal note to all other leaders in the continent of what not to do as a leader who is charting a course for a population so young.
So one other article, Musa, highlights or even mentions the economic repercussions of the political crisis, which probably include disruptions to businesses and also internet access in that country. How do you foresee these economic challenges exacerbating the social and political tensions in Senegal?
Indeed, we've always got to remember that, with such events, there's also the economic cost that needs to be counted. And for a country as strategically placed as Senegal is, if you consider the fact that the port in Dakar is West Africa's largest and most important port, challenging ports such as Lagos in that region. So Senegal is a very important country in terms of trade, in terms of investment, and in terms of driving greater African economic integration. But from a domestic perspective, of course, when you hear news such as the current internet services, this hinders the ability of the electorate to receive information which is critically needed to make informed decisions. And so access to information, access to internet, ensuring that you have a stable business condition and environment in a country are very critical things in aiding, a flourishing democracy built on stable institutions that favor democracy, that favor the rule of law, that favor the independence of the judiciary, that favor the separation of power. And that's very key, and that's what we're not seeing in Senegal. And unfortunately, for a country as important as this one to go in the direction that it is going, it is telling for the rest of the region, and it doesn't paint a good picture in the endeavor for the African Union to silence the guns to ensure stability of democracy and security in the continent.
So many residents in the capital, Dakar, such as Hassan Fall in the Kolobani market, who I heard express her view, have also expressed a sense of betrayal and a loss of faith in the democratic process. And it's also a point that was echoed by a journalist in Dakar yesterday during an interview right here on Newzroom Afrika. How do you believe that the government can then rebuild trust and legitimacy in the eyes of normal Senegalese people?
Well, one, the president would need to, perhaps call all leaders of political movements, political parties, particularly those represented in parliament, and particularly get to a political agreement on when is it best for these elections to be held, and also to go through all the constitutional challenges that are being faced in that country as it relates to the credibility of certain candidates and their ability and right to stand for these elections. There's got to be a return to the rule of law. There's got to be a return to negotiations. And for the president to take the country into his confidence by indeed extending an olive branch to all opposition parties and essentially, do away with his unilateral decree and go back to the status quo with when elections needed to be held. Now, of course, quite a lot of damage has been done by this particular action. And so February 25th may no longer, be seen as the ideal date for these elections, but certainly a negotiated time frame that isn't as far as December as this decree would set, but one that moves the elections closer, one that restores confidence in the Electoral Commission's ability to run these elections, and as well, there will be a need for external support, both from ECOWAS, the African Union, but also other players such as the EU. And again, as I've said in an interview in time past, where I said that, one of the challenges we see is because we don't have a clear African Union, sort of commission or organ that supports and deals with elections in the continent, this then stifles the African Union's ability to give an informed intervention in this particular crisis, but also a chance to strengthen the mechanisms in terms of elections. For example, the funding of elections becomes so important. We know in many African countries this tends to be a very huge challenge that goes on to undermine the quality and the rigor of those elections. And so there's a need for the African Union to find itself, to build the kind of continental mechanisms that are needed, and for the president within his realm is to essentially do away with the decree that he had signed, and rather go back to the drawing board and find a political and a constitutional resolution to this challenge.
Musa, let me give you an opportunity to sip some water or continue having your coffee, as we will continue our conversation with Musa Mdunge in a short while, speaking about the political situation in Senegal. We continue our discussion right now with Musa Mdunge, who's a political analyst, of course, looking at the situation in Senegal after the 25th of February election was moved by up to 10 months. Now, Musa, when we spoke a short while ago, we had started speaking about the potential ramifications of this move. But the use of security forces to suppress opposition voices and also the suspension of internet access are cited as tactics employed by the government to quell dissent. How do you assess the balance between maintaining public order and also respecting civil liberties in such situations?
That's always the great debate, right? So, a government has the responsibility of maintaining law and order, but at the same time, the challenge with, projecting this image of protecting law and order, it's very difficult when you are the one who is causing the instability itself. And so, it's kind of like shooting yourself in the foot. And so this is what the government has essentially done. And in order for it to return, short-term, medium-term, and long-term stability in the country, it's got to return to the norms of democracy, of the rule of law. It's got to ensure that it protects the rights of political parties. It must ensure that it protects the right of expression, the right of political association. These are very in order to maintaining law and order in a country. And thirdly, it must protect the right for people to receive information. And that's very important to ensure that people are then able to make informed decisions. If they want to see political opposition parties, come back to the table and, return to normal business, it will be important for the president to be the one who leads the opposition party in this dance. And it is key that, the president therefore returns and does away with this particular decree. The use of security forces, in maintaining law and order is very normal. Every country, every government has that responsibility. But there are limits even to the manner in which it does this, and there's ways in which it is able to do this, which must meet the constitutional framework of that particular country. And because Senegal is governed by a constitutional framework, one that maintains and upholds democracy and human rights at the center of that constitutional framework, it is key that all organs of state who are subject to that constitutional framework must therefore submit themselves, this including the president and the rest of the executive branch, as well as parliament, as well as the judiciary. The president is not above the law, nor are the security forces. And it's important that he maintains, the integrity of his government by meeting his utmost constitutional responsibility, which is the maintenance of the Constitution, human rights, and democracy.
So, staying with this theme, the opposition also suspects that the delay in elections is a ploy by President Sall to cling on to power, and you also alluded to this a bit earlier. In your analysis, what strategies should the opposition pursue to challenge this narrative and advocate for democratic principles?
Well, one of the levers that are in the hands of the opposition parties is, of course, taking a legal route in terms of this particular case, going to the judiciary, hopefully, of course, to the highest court of that country, in order to get the judiciary to force the executive to act correctly in accordance to the Constitution. So that is one way in which opposition parties could approach this matter. But that is, of course, if they indeed believe or have the perception that the judicial institutions within that country are strong enough, are independent, and are able to compel the executive to move in kind. And that is the great question that must be answered first. Secondly, of course, as they have done, they are on the streets. We see so many young people who are on the streets currently. And while that move may be well in drumming up instability, in blocking, government business from going on as usual, and as well as the business sector, and may be well smart in the sense of driving, conversation around this matter from a domestic to a global level. Case in point, the very fact that you and I are speaking about this matter, that strategy has its sell-by date, so there will be a need to see what more can be done. And the problem is, if the constitutional remedies are not sufficient or unable to move the dial, then it leaves unconstitutional remedies. And in the region that we are discussing, we know where this tends to go, where we could see a flaring up of domestic conflict and a rise of opposition parties taking up arms, and a military that will then respond in kind. And in a country as important as Senegal, it is an eventuality that none of us would like to see. So there is an important role that opposition parties can play in their response, and they need to also do a third thing, is to continue to rile up the international community to put pressure on Senegal and its political leaders to indeed respect democracy and ensure that these elections go on with no challenges.